Many years ago, I had an experience that solidified my aversion to camping. I've never been suited for it. The dirt, the insects, and the perpetually hard sleeping bags make for uncomfortable nights. Yet I've endured countless camping trips, none of my own volition. My father, a true outdoorsman, would routinely drag me and his equally rugged companions into the wilderness each summer to disconnect from technology and reconnect with nature. By my sophomore year of high school, I was tired of suffering in silence and finally persuaded him to let me bring a friend, hoping to make the ordeal more tolerable. Surprisingly, he agreed without much fuss. So I invited Charles, a classmate. One might assume bringing Charles would have worsened the situation, given his history as a dedicated Boy Scout and genuine love for camping. However, Charles was understanding. He'd playfully tease me about my dislike for it, but wasn't one of those "you're not a real man if you don't love the outdoors" types. Moreover, I reasoned that if I had to suffer, at least I'd be with someone capable of building a fire and pitching a tent without creating a disaster. He was enthusiastic about the trip, partly due to his love for camping, and partly because he consistently sought reasons to escape his parents. Unfortunately, the trip was marred from the start. It turned out one of my dad's friends had botched the campsite booking. Instead of a remote, serene forest location, we found ourselves at a dreadful, overdeveloped campsite. We're talking indoor restrooms, paved pathways, and even a children's playground. It wasn't camping, it was more like glorified backyard living, or glamping, I suppose. To say my dad was displeased would be an understatement. The real surprise came a few hours later. An amusement park lay directly adjacent to our campsite. I'm not exaggerating. A legitimate amusement park with carnival games, a Ferris wheel, and several roller coasters. It was surreal. These two environments were never meant to coexist. Everyone was furious. My dad and his friend grumbled about it not being real camping. And Charles wouldn't stop either. "This isn't real camping," he repeatedly remarked, as if I needed the reminder. It grew irritating as Charles kept making jokes about my family, implying we didn't understand what true camping entailed. Despite my disdain for camping, I do know what it's supposed to look like, so Charles's suggestions to the contrary were annoying. I told him to stop, and he complied. The whole situation was frustrating. We had driven for hours, so turning back wasn't an option. With no better alternative, we made the best of it. The adults sulked briefly, but eventually started setting up camp. Charles, of course, rose to the occasion. Within minutes, our tent was erected, all knots perfectly tied, the rainfly secured, staked, and taut as if lifted from a manual. Even my dad, who rarely offered praise unless someone was critically injured, nodded in approval, which slightly irked me. Charles and I shared a tent. After everything was set up and dinner was over, we slipped away under the guise of organizing our belongings. The truth was, Charles had brought a small metal pipe and some weed in an old Altoids tin. Nothing excessive, just enough to relax. It's worth noting that Charles and I were in that rebellious phase of life, enjoying mischief and frequenting places we shouldn't. I no longer smoke weed, and part of me often wonders if I only started because I was seeking to defy norms and stand out. Anyway, we snuck into the woods and smoked, giggling throughout. I don't think either of us worried about the smell, as we expected to avoid the adults for the rest of the night. After our session, we returned to the tent. Following a few hours of lounging and discussing school friends, we both realized we had too much energy to sleep. Charles had a mischievous grin, and I could already imagine his thoughts. He suggested we explore the campsite. I was skeptical until I realized he meant the amusement park, which immediately captivated my interest. He believed climbing one of the roller coasters would be simple. Climbing things was a favored pastime then, and the idea of scaling a roller coaster was thrilling. So, once we were certain everyone was asleep, we seized the opportunity. It was late, well past midnight. We grabbed our flashlights and headed for the park's perimeter fence. It wasn't difficult to climb. A small boost from Charles, and we were in. The area was dark, but security guards patrolled, their golf cart hum occasionally audible. It felt like a stealth video game, sneaking around, trying to evade detection. We progressed slowly, ducking behind structures and watching for patrols. At one point, we had to sprint across an open road to avoid a guard. It was exhilarating, yet terrifying. A hard feeling to describe. Everything felt like a game, but we both knew the consequences of getting caught would be severe. We finally reached the base of the roller coaster, which, up close, appeared much larger than it had from the campsite. We spotted the maintenance stairs running alongside the main ascent and didn't hesitate. The metal rungs clanged softly under our feet as we ascended, step by step, trying to minimize noise. Sections lacked railings, which was genuinely terrifying. We finally reached the summit, and the view was incredible. We could see the entire park below. We took only one photo there, as you can see. I wish we had taken more, but we were extremely cautious to avoid drawing attention, knowing we couldn't escape in time if spotted from below. Eventually, we decided we had pushed our luck enough and began our descent. After reaching the bottom, we crept back through the park the way we came. For some reason, the return journey was much quicker than the initial one. Perhaps the patrol was less intense at that hour. I couldn't say. We were roughly 5 minutes from where we hopped the fence when we had to stop. A guard was making a round in a golf cart, forcing us to quickly hide behind a snack shack. That's when I noticed movement in the darkness. Initially, I thought I imagined it, or it was a shadow from the golf cart's headlights. But then Charles tapped my arm and pointed in the same direction. I focused my gaze and confirmed it. About 30 feet away, barely visible in the darkness between two buildings, was another person. They were crouching like us, seemingly trying to avoid the guards. It didn't appear to be a child. The most unsettling part was my strong feeling that they were looking directly at us. At this point, we were genuinely frightened. Between the patrolling guards and this new presence, the situation was becoming overwhelming. Despite our desire to move, we couldn't. The guard hadn't passed yet. I kept my eyes fixed on the figure, and they began to move. They darted across an open patch of ground, passing directly through the spill of light from a nearby street lamp. For a split second, I saw him clearly. It was a man, as I suspected. He wore tattered clothing and had an awkward stride, as if injured or disfigured. But none of that was as disturbing as the dark liquid smeared across his face. It looked like blood. Charles saw it too, and we exchanged a truly terrified glance. Eventually, the man disappeared from view. The guard finally passed us, and we kept moving. We didn't exchange a word as we made our way back to the fence. I kept checking over my shoulder every few seconds, convinced we were being followed, but no one was there. We reached the fence, scaled it the same way we entered, and dropped to the other side. The difference was, this time, we didn't laugh about it. All I wanted was to be back in the safe confines of our tent. I could tell Charles felt the same. By the time we returned to our tent, neither of us mentioned sleeping. We just lay in our sleeping bags, trying to comprehend what we had seen. The best we could come up with was that it was some homeless man doing who knows what. A foolish explanation, I know, but we couldn't think of anything else. The next morning began normally. We woke up, ate, and started packing our fishing gear. But around 10 a.m., a camp staffer approached our tent site and made an announcement intended for the entire campsite. Apparently, a man had been stabbed and killed the previous night at a lake about 4 miles from the campground. Details were scarce, but the perpetrator was still at large, and the local sheriff's office had instructed all park rangers and campsite staff within a certain radius to be on high alert. They described him as a disheveled white male in his late 30s, shirtless, possibly bleeding or with blood on his clothes. Then, they instructed us to pack our belongings and leave for our safety. Charles and I immediately connected the dots. It had to be the individual we'd observed the previous night. We remained silent, refraining from informing my father or the rangers. To this day, I'm not entirely sure why. I anticipate criticism, and I understand why. But at that age, my primary concern was avoiding trouble above all else. I still criticize myself for not speaking up. My testimony could have led to the apprehension of a dangerous individual who might have gone on to commit further offenses. Charles and I remain close. We attended the same college, graduated together, and now work in similar fields. However, this experience is something we rarely discuss. Honestly, I believe Charles harbors more guilt than I do about our silence. Nonetheless, putting aside errors and remorse, I find it astonishing that my friend and I were mere feet away from a murderer on the run. I prefer not to contemplate what might have transpired had our paths truly crossed that night. This incident occurred in October 2016, amidst the widespread news coverage of the bizarre clown hysteria. Reports of creepy clown sightings were surfacing nationwide. Most were clearly hoaxes or attempts to gain attention, but as you know, there were a few genuinely terrifying cases. What happened to me was one of them. I was 16, a junior in high school. After finishing my 7th period and bidding farewell to my friends, I boarded the northbound number 6 train. The train was largely empty, which was unusual but not unheard of. I wasn't particularly observant of my surroundings as I had my headphones in, blasting music, probably Drake. To compound matters, I was reviewing chemistry flashcards on my phone, making me as oblivious as humanly possible. This is never a good idea when traveling alone, but I was familiar enough with the area to feel reasonably safe. My plan was to disembark at 96th Street and walk home from there. Nothing out of the ordinary, just a typical Wednesday. But things quickly took a turn for the worse. Upon arriving at 96th Street, I instinctively leaped from my seat, barely glancing up to confirm it was the correct station. I had taken that train ride so many times that the routine had become second nature. Getting on and off was almost a reflex. With my head still buried in my phone and music still blaring, I made my way to the doors. But as soon as they slid open, I noticed, in my peripheral vision, something obstructing my path. I looked up and realized a man had stepped directly into the doorway. Only, it wasn't a normal person. It was a clown. He was in full costume. Oversized rainbow pants, a baggy yellow shirt with red suspenders, giant red shoes, and exaggerated white makeup smeared across his face. A red nose, blue eyebrows, the complete cartoon nightmare. The only thing missing was the wig. I was literally frozen in shock at the sight of him. Not only was I caught completely off guard, but I had never before been in such close proximity to something so bizarre. He said nothing, simply stood there, not attempting to board the train, but clearly preventing my exit. Snapping out of my daze, I realized I had a good 5 seconds before the doors would close, so I had to act. I attempted to push past him, but the very moment I made contact, he leaned down in one fluid motion, as if trying to get face to face with me. Before he could grab or restrain me, I darted past him. That's when he lunged forward, attempting to tackle me. I dodged him and continued running, and he began to pursue me. It was terrifying. There was no one else around, and I was being chased by a killer clown. The 96th Street station is relatively quiet in the early afternoon, so I was essentially on my own. I glanced behind me and saw him still pursuing, but his stride was abnormal, a jerky motion, as if his limbs were disproportionate. However, I was much more focused on what he now held in his hand, what appeared to be a kitchen knife. I didn't know where he had hidden it or what his intentions were, but I didn't care. I ran up the stairs and out of the station, immediately reporting the situation to the police. He didn't follow me onto the street, but I was still pretty shaken up. The police dispatched someone to the station, but by then, he was gone. Even after speaking with the police and being reassured of my safety, I couldn't shake the irrational thought that he somehow knew where I lived and would track me down later. But that obviously didn't happen. In fact, nothing else ever happened. I wouldn't be surprised if my story ended up on the news as one of the many strange clown encounters of 2016. Although I can't say for sure, it took me a few weeks to fully recover from this experience. This isn't your typical scary story, but I promise it's worth a listen. I was 2 years out of undergrad when this whole thing began. While I was technically pursuing an online graduate certificate at the same university where I earned my bachelor's, I still found myself with an abundance of free time. During that period of my life, I was bouncing between various odd jobs, seeking any gig to fill my hours and help me build up some savings. Let's just say Indeed was my closest ally at the time. I honestly found 90% of my leads from that single website. I was growing tired of doing DoorDash deliveries in the same 6 neighborhoods for minimum wage, so I decided a change of pace was in order. Later that night, as I browsed Indeed, I stumbled upon something intriguing. It was a private lifeguarding position at a hotel a few towns over. I know that doesn't sound particularly unusual on its own, but a couple of strange details in the listing gave me pause. First, the hours were inverted. They weren't typical pool hours. You'd expect a standard hotel pool to open sometime in the morning and close sometime in the evening, with perhaps a few hours of downtime in the middle of the day, right? Well, this was the exact opposite. They sought someone to operate and supervise a swimming pool from 5 p.m. to 1 a.m. during the week. It was essentially a night shift for a pool. That wasn't the oddest part, though. The requirements explicitly requested an individual who did not speak Spanish. Let me reiterate. They specifically wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish. Here was the issue. I've been speaking Spanish since I was a child. I am quite literally half Mexican. The town where the hotel was located was also predominantly populated by Spanish-speaking Americans, so that requirement made little sense to me. In fact, nothing about the listing made sense to me. I remember being utterly perplexed as I sifted through it. However, there was one aspect I felt quite good about: $30 an hour, which would probably equate to something like $50 in today's inflation-adjusted economy. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but the point is, $30 an hour back then was like stubbing your toe on a gold bar. Suffice it to say, I disregarded all the other peculiar details and chose to focus my attention on the compensation. I decided I would simply pretend not to know Spanish. What were they going to do? The gig must have been either brand new or in very low demand, because I received a callback and an interview invitation within a few hours. Fast forward to the first day. I drove up to the hotel, and everything looked exactly as you'd expect. A pudgy, Mexican-looking man came out to greet me, and we exchanged information and shared a laugh. He was actually very friendly and quite funny, and his amiable demeanor put me somewhat at ease. But as we were walking into the complex, another, taller man rounded a corner and started staring me down. I immediately recognized that I was being profiled and began to wonder if the initial welcoming behavior was a ploy to get me to lower my guard. The second man walked directly up to me and began communicating with me in Spanish. He didn't smile, didn't say hello, didn't shake my hand. Nothing. I instantly knew what he was doing. He was trying to assess whether or not I knew Spanish, so the listing hadn't been fabricated. I gave him a blank stare, even though I understood every word. He wasn't saying anything outrageous, by the way. He was just rambling about the weather or something, Nothing important enough to remember. After a few seconds, I turned to the first man, who then turned to the taller man, and both burst out laughing as if they had been in on some practical joke. The taller man flashed a smile, extended his hand, and said he was just messing with me. I played along, but I was a little unsettled. He introduced himself as Jefe, and the bigger man as Esteban. The three of us walked through the complex to reach the pool, and the taller man, whom I assumed was in charge, began to explain the job to me. According to him, they needed someone to work later hours because they wanted to increase revenue, and they planned to start charging non-guests to use the pool. I wasn't even sure if that was legal, but I wasn't about to complain. I was told they wanted someone who didn't speak Spanish because it would prevent rowdy outsiders from trying to harass me. A rationale I didn't fully grasp, but went along with nonetheless. My responsibilities were as follows. Lifeguard, obviously, collect money from non-guests attempting to enter the pool, and call Jefe if there was any kind of problem. And there was one more thing. Jefe told me that if anyone showed me a blue wristband, I was to let them into what he called the pool house, which was a huge building behind the lifeguard stand. I didn't ask questions. The first week was really chill. In fact, the first few weeks were. Far more people utilized the pool than I had anticipated, presenting me with considerable work. I collected payments from non-guests and maintained vigilance. Initially, no one presented a wristband. Approximately a month into my tenure, a buff Hispanic man, sporting shades and a white button-down shirt, approached me. He clearly had no command of English, but showed me a wristband, prompting me to unlock the pool house. Roughly an hour later, he emerged and proceeded toward the exit gate. Since the pool house door locked automatically, I didn't need to engage with him or move from my position, but I observed his departure. His backpack appeared noticeably fuller than when he arrived, yet otherwise, everything seemed normal. Over the subsequent weeks, an increasing number of individuals began displaying wristbands, and many started arriving in groups. More and more non-guests also started frequenting the pool, as my monetary collections significantly increased beyond anything I had experienced before. At one point, I realized I was actually receiving excessive payments, with people consistently overpaying me by an absurd amount. I contacted Jefe about it, and he dismissed my concerns, attributing it to common mistakes. I could tell he wished to avoid further discussion, as he abruptly ended the call mid-sentence. Amidst all the suspicious occurrences, that brief, seemingly innocuous phone call affirmed to me that I was embroiled in something far more significant than merely lifeguarding a swimming pool. Only after hanging up did the true gravity of the situation fully register. My mind began to filter out all extraneous thoughts until a single idea, seemingly unshakable, solidified. Money laundering. I found myself at a loss. On one hand, my intuition screamed that I was involved in illicit activities and should flee immediately. Yet, on the other, I had no secure way to validate this suspicion and was unwilling to forfeit a $30 an hour job over nothing. Consequently, I remained silent and kept the employment. However, from that moment onward, I began to connect the dots. The structure I had been told was a pool house was unequivocally the site of shadowy dealings, illegal gambling, drug trafficking, or perhaps something even more sinister. Whatever it was transpiring right behind me every single day, shielded only by a single locked door. Patrons of the pool, particularly those with wristbands, grew friendlier. Strangers started learning my name, and my role expanded beyond merely collecting money to receiving tips, high fives, and greetings. As people became more comfortable around me, they started conversing openly in my presence. I would catch fragments of their Spanish conversations, and suffice it to say, all my suspicions were confirmed. Admittedly, the added perks made overlooking everything else considerably easier. Moreover, my hands were clean. I was employed to perform a job, and that is precisely what I was doing. Speaking of the job, I actually had to rescue a drowning child a few days later. It wasn't an overtly heroic act, merely a child who had ventured too far into the deep end and clearly couldn't swim. But upon returning to the surface, everyone gave me a standing ovation. It was a truly unique sensation. Afterward, he actually descended from wherever he had been in the hotel and personally thanked me for my excellent lifeguarding. He claimed he owed me his life, a statement I didn't comprehend until I realized the child I had saved was his son. The following day, Jefe Esteban and several other men, some of whom I recognized as wristband wearers, were all waiting at the gate to greet me with a glass of wine. That obviously felt wonderful, but the good feeling did not endure. After everyone toasted me, one of the men offered a toast in Spanish. I don't recall the exact words, but it was hardly a pleasant speech. He was essentially toasting to the immense profits they were accumulating and to the lives they were destroying, whatever that implied. Everyone laughed and drank, but that was the moment I realized I had become entangled in something deeply insidious. No amount of money or tips should have justified my prolonged presence at that hotel, and regrettably, I had stayed. The next day, my mother called me while I was at the pool. Without delving into details, my mother, bless her soul, never called unless it was of significant importance. So I had to answer. I descended from my stand and moved to what I believed was a secluded alcove for privacy. My mother only spoke Spanish, so naturally I conversed with her in Spanish. I don't recall the reason for her call. What I do remember is that after hanging up and turning to return to the pool, Esteban stood directly in my path, staring at me. He did not resemble the friendly individual I had encountered on my first day at the pool. After a rather awkward silence, he inquired how long I had known Spanish. I feigned ignorance, stating I was merely practicing with a friend and aspiring to learn. But I knew he saw right through me. He continued to stare, as if contemplating something. My heart raced, and I felt as though he was debating whether or not to harm me. Eventually, he simply said, "Okay," and turned away. I immediately returned to my post. I considered leaving, but couldn't compel myself out of the chair. They might have interpreted that as a sign of guilt. I could have been failing a test. They likely knew where I lived. These thoughts surged through my mind as I silently prayed for my life, frozen to that chair. A few minutes before my shift concluded, he approached me and instructed me to arrive an hour early the following day, as he would have a new opportunity to offer me. Then he tipped me a couple $100 and walked back into the hotel. When I left the hotel that day, I never returned. Absolutely not. That situation had no favorable outcome. I don't believe